Imagine a summer so hot it felt like the world was holding its breath. A small town in Tennessee, Dry Creek Hollow, where everyone knew everyone, and life moved at the pace of a slow-moving creek. But beneath that tranquil surface, a decades-old secret, a buried injustice, was about to resurface with a vengeance. What if an entire family, a father, a mother, and their 4 children, could simply vanish from their home in the stifling July heat, leaving behind only the ghost of laughter and the silent mystery of their bicycles? For 14 long years, that was the chilling reality in Dry Creek Hollow, a silence only broken by whispers and unspoken fears. But sometimes the earth and the forgotten waters of a lake refuse to keep their secrets forever. This is the harrowing, true story of the Granger family and the shocking discovery in 1990 that finally broke a 14-year silence, forcing a town to confront the terrifying truth hidden beneath its quiet facade. Get ready to dive deep into a mystery where every pedal stroke led to a vanishing point, and justice waited beneath the muddy secrets of a shrinking lake. Before we unravel this incredible story, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring more untold mysteries to light. The shadow of old sins in Dry Creek Hollow, July 1976, brought stifling heat to Dry Creek Hollow, a town too small to notice the quiet return of old sins. Walter Granger, once the sharpest badge in the county, now wore his retirement like a loose collar, enjoying lazy afternoons on dusty front porches. His wife, Ellen, fussed over lemonade, while their 4 children, Claire, Henry, Jacob, and little Ruthie, chased each other through the yard, their laughter stitching through the summer air like a carefree hymn. 10 years prior, folks said Walter had saved Dry Creek from riots. But Walter held a dark secret. The man he'd locked away was innocent. That man, Roy Mercera, had walked out of Stonewall Penitentiary on a Tuesday, a day so hot it warped the road signs. Nobody in Dry Creek Hollow saw him slip back into town, leaner, quieter, with a hunger coiled in every muscle. He had a curse whispered through steel bars. "I will find you when they set me free." For weeks, Roy watched the Grangers from a battered pickup truck parked at the edge of the tree line. He observed the children, so close in age they tumbled like puppies, riding their bikes with carefree abandon. Ellen's laughter, careless in the warmth of a summer she believed would last forever, only fueled Roy's grim resolve. He traced their laughter on his cracked windshield, just as he once traced prison walls in the dark. Saturday promised a family bike ride to Willow Lake, complete with a picnic basket and fresh sandwiches. Ellen packed towels, while Walter, still clinging to old badge habits, checked the bicycle brakes twice. None of them saw the dull glint of binoculars in the pines or the dirt on Roy's boots as he moved closer to the water's edge, long before the family pedaled down the dusty lane. The unsettling silence. Later that day, as dusk settled, a neighbor leaned over her fence and noticed the Grangers hadn't returned. She dismissed it, telling herself they were likely camping overnight, enjoying the sunset over Willow Lake. She didn't think about the man who once swore Dry Creek Hollow would pay him back, starting with the man who made him a ghost in his own life. By morning, the Granger house sat still and quiet. A jug of lemonade sweated alone on the porch, untouched. The 4 bicycles, symbols of childhood freedom, never returned from the road that led straight to the waiting dark. Mabel Stokes, who lived 2 houses down, tried to convince herself for 2 whole days that the family was simply on an unexpected camping trip. But on the 3rd day, with Walter's old patrol cruiser still parked under the sagging carport and the front porch untouched except for flies circling the spoiled lemonade, she finally dialed Sheriff Ellis McKinnon. McKinnon, a man who once wore the same uniform as Walter, but never half as well, arrived mid-afternoon. He peered through every window, knocking politely, though he knew no one would answer. Inside, he found 4 dinner plates still in the sink, half a loaf of bread going stale, and Ellen's favorite cardigan draped over the sofa. Outside, Mabel wrung her hands. "They ever leave without telling you?" McKinnon asked. Mabel shook her head, eyes wide with fear. "Walter always let me know. Said a good neighbor was the best lock money couldn't buy." McKinnon squinted at the dirt road, kicking at the fresh bicycle tracks still imprinted where the family had pedaled off 3 days earlier. He followed those tracks halfway to the old bridge before they faded into gravel and forest shade. The fruitless search and lingering fear. By sunset, Dry Creek Hollow buzzed with talk. Neighbors formed loose search lines, trampling through tall grass and brambles, calling the children's names until hoarse voices and bug bites sent them home in defeat. McKinnon didn't stop. He stood at the lake's edge, staring at water so still it mocked him with his own reflection. Somewhere in those woods, Roy Mercera watched from behind the ruin of an old logging shack, his breath steady as the cicadas whined through pine needles. He smiled when McKinnon's flashlight beam skimmed a patch of grass he'd flattened days ago. He smiled because Dry Creek Hollow had always trusted its fences and polite locked doors. Roy knew better now. At dawn, McKinnon called in state troopers and dogs. A dozen men in gray uniforms pushed through briars, dogs lunging and barking at every rabbit trail. They found nothing but an empty picnic basket half buried near the lake bank, sandwich wrappers scattered and slick with dew. Ellen's initials were stitched on the cloth lining, faded but unmistakable. McKinnon pocketed it gently, hoping the fabric might confess something he couldn't yet hear. Back at the Granger house, a deputy taped up crime scene ribbons that fluttered in the summer breeze. Curious kids on banana seat bikes gathered at the end of the drive, whispering rumors about ghosts and escaped lunatics. In the shadows behind the Miller barn, Roy Mercera cleaned his boots in a creek that remembered nothing. He murmured to himself, counting the days it took him to find the Grangers, and the nights he'd replayed every hour of Stonewall Penitentiary, carving Walter Granger's name into every wall his knuckles could reach. Nobody saw him slip back into town a second time, dirt washed clean, smile hidden behind a stolen Sunday suit. Sheriff McKinnon wrote in his final report that week, family presumed missing voluntarily, no signs of struggle, investigation suspended until new evidence surfaces. He closed the file, locked it in his desk, and did his best to forget the uneasy itch between his shoulder blades every time he passed the Granger property after dusk. Dry Creek Hollow slept with its doors locked, its prayers whispered twice as hard, never suspecting the man it feared most was close enough to watch them dream. The lake's silent revelation. For 14 summers, the Granger house sat quiet at the end of Hawthorne Lane, its windows bleached by sun and gossip. Children dared each other to peek through broken shutters, whispering about ghost voices and bicycle bells echoing through the tall grass. Sheriff Ellis McKinnon retired in 1985, his bones too tired to chase shadows that never spoke. Dry Creek Hollow replaced him with Sheriff Dan Whitam, younger, college-trained, and more interested in speed traps than a cold case older than half his deputies. By 1990, the orchard behind the lake grew wild again, reclaiming paths where 4 small bikes once rattled over roots. That summer, a severe drought made every pond, creek, and forgotten swimming hole shrink back from its own muddy secrets. When the July heat clawed Willow Lake down to a sickly puddle, a local handyman named Curtis Bledsoe took a shortcut across the dry bend. He almost didn't see it, a curve of rust poking through the baked muck, a perfect arc where nature had been forced to forget. Curtis squatted in the stink, pushed at the silt with a stick, and felt the tug of something hollow and old. He stumbled back when it gave way, a bicycle tire, rubber cracked, spokes eaten to lace by time and water. He jogged to the roadside payphone, sweat dripping as coins clinked. Within the hour, Sheriff Whitam squinted at the tire poking from Willow Lake's shrunken belly. A deputy snapped Polaroids, while an old fisherman mumbled that this lake never gave up what it swallowed unless you made it angry first. The next day, divers dredged the shallows, dragging out a second tire, then a bent handlebar, then the twisted frame of a child's bike, still bearing faded streamers on one grip. Whitam flipped through the ancient missing persons file in his squad car, sweat pooling under his collar. Walter Granger's name stared back like an accusation McKinnon had failed to erase. He rubbed the Polaroid of 4 kids beaming at the camera, bicycles lined up behind them like ponies waiting for a race. Same streamers, same handlebar grips. He slammed the file shut. Dry Creek Hollow buzzed again, porch talk turning sharp and fearful. Some neighbors claimed the Grangers had run off to Florida. Others said Walter's past found him. Whitam hated both answers. He wanted a clean confession, or at least bones to bury with an honest tombstone. He ordered more of the lake bed dredged by volunteers and off-duty deputies. On day 3, a half-buried picnic basket surfaced, its lid cracked like an old coffin. Inside was a scrap of Ellen Granger's floral apron, twisted into mud. Whitam pocketed it gently, the same way McKinnon had done years before. At his office, Whitam stared at the town map, pencil tracing the route from the Granger house to Willow Lake. 14 years had erased many footprints, but not every question. He called state forensics, ordering DNA tests on the apron scrap, though he knew no lab needed to tell him whose hands once folded sandwiches inside it. That night, Whitam locked the station alone, his cruiser humming past the Granger place one more time. He cut the headlights just long enough to see the porch sag deeper, weeds wrapping the front steps like fingers reclaiming what the town refused to touch. Far beyond the fence line, a shape moved at the tree edge. Too upright to be an animal, too patient to be a ghost. Whitam slowed, window cracked. The shape didn't flinch, didn't run, just watched. He shivered, pressed the gas. In Dry Creek Hollow, some sins stayed buried. Others waited until the water got low enough to breathe again. The truth emerges. Sheriff Dan Whitam spent 3 straight nights in his office chair, neck aching from files stacked higher than the trophy buck mounted on the squad room wall. He read every scribbled note Ellis McKinnon ever wrote about the Grangers. None of it was enough to explain why 4 bicycles drowned themselves in Willow Lake while an entire family vanished without a single scream heard. The DNA test came back in a yellow envelope marked urgent. Whitam slid it open, eyes scanning the lab jargon until one word pinned him to his chair. Match. It was Ellen Granger's apron. No question left. He knew if he said it out loud, "They never left," it would crack Dry Creek Hollow wide open like an old stump rotted at the heart. But silence had choked this town long enough. By Friday, he stood before the town council, dusty hat in his hands, explaining to old men in church suits that they might have a mass grave at the bottom of their fishing spot. The councilmen exchanged side glances and muttered about tourists and property values. One leaned forward, voice slick with forced calm. "Sheriff, best you keep this under your hat until you're sure. Folks don't like scandal or panic." Whittam's knuckles turned white around his hat brim. "This isn't scandal, Mr. Harlan. This is a murdered family. Your town let it sit under algae and bass for damn years. I'm not keeping it quiet." He stormed out before they could vote him down. Outside, 2 local reporters already sniffed the edges of the lake, snapping photos of yellow tape strung along the boat ramp. Whitam let them. Truth needed daylight now more than dignity. Meanwhile, Roy Mercera watched it all from a safe distance. He'd been careful for so long, living under borrowed names, picking up cash jobs 2 counties over. He knew the water would betray him eventually, but counted on Dry Creek Hollow's polite cowardice to cover the stink. He never planned on a young sheriff with a righteous streak. Under the moth-eaten tarp behind an abandoned filling station, Roy cleaned his old rifle by lantern light, whispering the same prayer he'd mouthed the day he walked out of Stonewall. No loose ends, no sins left for strangers to confess. He knew Whittam's type, a bloodhound, loyal to the last drop, a sword who'd keep digging until he struck bone or bullet. On Saturday night, Whitam found his tires slashed behind the diner. No fingerprints, just a warning carved into the hood with a cheap pocket knife. Let them rest. He didn't show it to his deputies. He just ordered 4 new tires and locked his office twice as hard. By Monday, a diver found the rusted frame of an adult's bicycle caught in a tangle of willow roots near the lake's far shore. The forensics tech on scene went pale when he lifted a child's shoe wedged in the spokes. Canvas rotted, but laces still knotted neat by a mother's hand. Whitam taped off the entire lakeshore, pushing gawkers back with polite threats, and an unsmiling deputy at each bend of the road. Dry Creek Hollow hummed with fear under its polite hum of gossip. The local church filled twice as full Sunday morning, neighbors whispering psalms as if forgiveness might patch 14 years of blind eyes. Roy Mercera sat in the back pew, head bowed low, hat tipped to hide the grin tugging at his lips. He didn't pray with them. He prayed to the bones still hidden where even low water wouldn't reach. An insurance policy no sheriff's badge could dredge up in daylight, he mouthed his old promise once more, no loose ends. Across town, Whitam traced a map of the lake. Every new clue, a pin driven deep into the place Dry Creek Hollow once fished in peace. He didn't know Roy was close enough to see him through a dirty church window, planning exactly how to end the Granger's ghost story before another shovel struck the wet earth that still kept its darkest mouth shut. Part 2. The Sheriff's Reckoning. Sheriff Dan Whitam returned to the Granger house, the news of the discovered bicycles and Ellen's apron heavy on his mind. He walked through the silent rooms, dust motes dancing in the afternoon light, each creak of the floorboards a whisper from the past. The house, long declared empty, felt alive with unanswered questions. Whitam wasn't looking for ghosts, he was looking for secrets. The kind a man like Walter Granger, an old-school lawman, might keep from the world. He knew Walter's reputation, a man of order, but also a man of secrets. He ran his hands over the rough wood paneling in Walter's study, a room filled with the scent of old paper and stale pipe smoke. His gaze lingered on a section of wall that seemed slightly off-kilter, a faint seam running vertically where none should be. With a jolt of intuition, Whitam pushed, and a section of the bookshelf swung inward, revealing a small, hidden vault just large enough for a man to stand in. Inside, a single wooden crate sat amidst a few dusty boxes. It wasn't full of money or jewels, but something far more valuable to a cold case. Journals. Walter Granger's journals. Whitam carried the crate back to his office, the old wood smelling of forgotten lives. He poured himself a mug of bitter coffee and began to read, page by agonizing page, delving into the mind of a man haunted by his own choices. The journals were Walter's confessional, a meticulous record of his triumphs and, more chillingly, his moral compromises. Walter's confession, the framing of Roy Mercera, the entries chronicled the summer of 1966, a decade before the Grangers vanished. Dry Creek Hollow was on the brink, not from simple riots, but from a burgeoning drug trade that threatened to consume the town's youth. Gangs, fueled by outside money, were turning quiet streets into battlegrounds. Walter Granger, then a rising star in the county, was under immense pressure to clean up the town, to make an example. He wrote of late-night meetings with powerful figures in the community, Judge Harrison, Mayor Caldwell, and a shady businessman named Joe Donnie Men, who wanted the problem gone, quickly and quietly, without exposing their own subtle complicity in the town's darker dealings. Walter confessed to what he did next. He framed Roy Mercera. Roy, a quiet, unassuming loner, had a reputation for being hot-headed when provoked, but was fundamentally innocent of the major crimes sweeping the town. Walter, under pressure from the town's elite who wanted a quick resolution and minimal scandal, seized on a minor scuffle involving Mercera and manipulated evidence. He planted a gun, fabricated witness statements, and coerced a shaky confession. Roy Mercera, an innocent man, was sent to Stonewall Penitentiary for a crime he didn't commit, a scapegoat sacrifice to restore order and protect the town's powerful secret benefactors. Walter wrote of his guilt, the sleepless nights, the cold dread that settled over him every time he thought of Mercera behind bars. He justified it as a necessary evil, a bitter pill to swallow for the greater good of Dry Creek Hollow. A small sacrifice, but he had written it had saved the whole garden. But the guilt gnawed at him, even as the town praised him as a hero. Roy Mercera, the quiet man's transformation. Whitam then pulled Roy Mercer's old file from the archives. Before prison, Roy was known as a solitary but harmless man, working odd jobs, spending his evenings fishing. He was strong, quiet, and easily overlooked, but the prison records told a different story. Mercera, once unassuming, became a ghost of a man inside Stonewall, simmering with silent rage. He learned to survive, to endure, to watch. He became meticulously patient, transforming his quiet nature into a chilling resolve. The journals hinted at a deep-seated fear Walter carried after Mercer's trial. A letter Roy had sent, smuggled out of prison with a single chilling line, "I will find you when they set me free. And then the score will be settled, in full." This wasn't just a threat. It was a promise. Walter's journal entries grew increasingly paranoid as Mercer's release date approached. He spoke of nightmares, of seeing Roy's face in every shadow, of checking his doors twice, then 3 times. He had tried to hide his family to move, but Ellen, rooted in Dry Creek Hollow, had refused. The town's silence, Whitam realized, was not just ignorance. It was complicity, born of fear and self-preservation. The same powerful men who had pushed Walter to frame Mercera had then ensured his story was never challenged. They had reaped the benefits of the peace Walter had established, a peace built on injustice. They kept quiet out of self-interest, protecting their own reputations and the illicit dealings that had flourished once the troublemakers were gone, the unsent letter and a chilling revelation. Buried deep within Walter's final journal, Whitam found an unsent letter, its paper brittle and stained with age. It was addressed to Roy Mercera, a desperate, rambling plea for forgiveness, for understanding. Walter wrote of the unbearable weight of his guilt, of the compromises he'd made, and how he had believed, foolishly, that he could contain the consequences of his actions. He even offered Roy money, a new life, anything to avoid the inevitable reckoning. It was clear Walter had known, with terrifying certainty, that Roy was coming for him. The letter was dated July 14th, 1976, the day before the Granger family vanished. Whitam reread the entries leading up to that date. Walter had noted Roy Mercer's release, confirmed through a contact, a week prior. He had seen Roy's battered pickup truck near their property. He knew. Walter, it seemed, had fully understood the impending storm. The planned bike ride to Willow Lake was not just a family outing. It was an attempt to escape, to put distance between themselves and the inevitable. Walter, a man who once controlled a town with his badge, was now trying to outrun a ghost from his past. The image of the 4 bicycles at the bottom of the lake, coupled with the empty picnic basket, now made horrifying sense. The Grangers weren't simply missing, they were victims. And their disappearance was not a mystery. It was the chilling, deliberate culmination of a long-simmering act of revenge, meticulously planned by a man wronged, a man who had waited patiently for his freedom and then for his vengeance. Whitam knew he had the motive, he had the method. Now he needed to find Roy Mercer. But Roy Mercer, unlike the Granger family, had learned how to truly disappear. And the lake, Whitam suspected, still held one more, darker secret, one that only Roy Mercer could reveal. Part 3, The Lake's Final Confession. The discovery of Ellen Granger's apron and the children's bicycles had shattered Dry Creek Hollow's uneasy peace, leaving Sheriff Dan Whitam with an unshakable conviction. The Grangers hadn't vanished. They had been murdered. The lake, now shrunken by drought, had begun to give up its secrets. Whitam, haunted by Walter Granger's journals and Roy Mercer's chilling promise, knew the most horrific truth still lay hidden beneath the murky waters. He secured a larger team, including state police divers and cadaver dogs. The search around Willow Lake intensified, focusing on the deeper, silt-filled sections of the lakebed, particularly the area near where Frank Miller, in his confession about Sarah Patterson's case, had described the disposal. While that was a different case, the common thread was the use of a body of water for concealment. Whitam suspected Mercer, driven by vengeance, would have used a similar method of concealment. The air around the lake, once filled with the drone of cicadas, now hummed with the methodical whir of sonar equipment and the tense silence of men dredging for the dead. Days bled into weeks, the summer heat relentless, but Whitam pushed his team, driven by the faces in the Granger family photo. Then, one sweltering afternoon, a diver surfaced, his face pale beneath the mud and algae. He held up a small, weathered doll, its plastic features warped, but still recognizable as a child's toy. It was identical to one Ruthie Granger clutched in a faded family photograph. A few yards away, sonar detected a significant anomaly, a large unnatural depression in the lakebed, the unearthing of a nightmare. The next few hours were a blur of grim, methodical work. Under the supervision of forensics experts, the lakebed was carefully excavated. The first discovery was a small, rusted metal box, secured with a padlock chain. It contained Walter Granger's badge and service revolver, along with Ellen's wedding ring and a handful of old family photographs, sealed in a waterproof bag. It was a macabre time capsule, left by Walter to mark his family's final resting place, or perhaps a desperate attempt to ensure their memory endured, even if their bodies never surfaced. Then the true horror began to emerge. Buried deep within the silt, beneath a makeshift layer of rocks and heavy debris, the first skeletal remains were discovered. Then another, and another. The scene was overwhelming, a silent testament to a brutal crime committed decades ago. Piece by agonizing piece, the skeletal remains of the entire Granger family were recovered from the shallow, muddy grave. Walter, Ellen, Claire, Henry, Jacob, and little Ruthie. They were found together, intertwined in death, just as they had been in life. Forensic analysis, though challenging due to decades of submersion and decay, confirmed the identities through dental records and bone structure. The initial reports indicated blunt force trauma and signs of struggle on Walter and Ellen's remains. The children showed no signs of struggle, suggesting they were likely suffocated or drowned, perhaps quickly, to prevent their screams. It was a cold, deliberate act, executed with chilling precision. The Granger family had not run away. They had been brutally silenced. And the pieces of the narrative, Walter's journals, Roy Mercer's revenge, and the town's complicity snapped into horrifying focus. Dry Creek Hollow's reckoning. The discovery of the Granger family's remains sent shockwaves through Dry Creek Hollow. The initial whispers of a family who had run off to Florida were replaced by a deafening silence, then a chorus of shame and fear. The news media descended upon the small town, reporters swarming the lakefront, interviewing trembling neighbors who now spoke of seeing Roy Mercer around town in 1976, of a bad feeling they'd had but never voiced. The town, once so quick to accept Walter Granger's fabricated peace, was forced to confront its own long-held complicity. The fear that had kept them silent for decades, fear of angering Walter Granger, fear of exposing the town's deeper corruption, now manifested as collective guilt. Churches filled with somber faces, not seeking forgiveness for sins of their own, but for the collective sin of silence. Old-timers who had praised Walter as a hero now looked away, their faces etched with the truth of their unspoken complicity. The revelation that Roy Mercera had been wrongly imprisoned ripped through the town's carefully constructed narrative, exposing the rot at its core. McKinnon's initial report, dismissing the disappearance as voluntary, now seemed a deliberate act of negligence, a convenient lie that served to bury the town's dirty secret alongside the Granger family. Sheriff Whitam held a press conference by the still, sad waters of Willow Lake, flanked by state investigators. His voice, hoarse from days of investigation, resonated with quiet fury as he announced the identification of the Granger family and officially declared their deaths a homicide. He spoke of the journals, of the fabricated evidence against Roy Mercera, and of the town's complicity. He promised justice not just for the Grangers, but for Roy Mercera, the innocent man whose life had been shattered. The Phantom of Vengeance. As the town grappled with its dark past, Roy Mercera, the Phantom of Vengeance, grew increasingly agitated. He had watched the news reports from afar, a grim satisfaction mixing with a surge of paranoia. He knew the discovery of the Grangers meant they were closing in on him. He had spent 14 years living in the shadows, moving from state to state, taking on temporary jobs, his life a constant exercise in evasion. He had meticulously planned his revenge, the years in prison sharpening his mind, hardening his heart. He believed he had left no trace, no witness. But the lake had betrayed him. Roy Mercera had meticulously tracked Walter Granger's family, observing their routines, their habits. He had waited for the perfect opportunity, the day they were most vulnerable, most isolated. The bike ride to Willow Lake was his chosen setting, a place where he could isolate them, a place where he could bury them, just as Walter had buried his freedom. He remembered the children's faces as they rode past him that day, their innocent laughter echoing in his ears as he stalked them through the woods. He remembered the look of pure terror on Walter Granger's face when he finally confronted him by the lake, the realization that his past had finally caught up to him. He remembered the brutal efficiency of his actions, the cold satisfaction of exacting his long-awaited retribution. He had felt no remorse, only the grim satisfaction of a score finally settled. Now, as Whitam launched a full-scale manhunt, Roy Mercera moved. He abandoned his latest temporary home, emptied his bank accounts, and severed all ties, shedding his identity like a snake sheds its skin. He knew Dry Creek Hollow had finally woken up. He also knew he couldn't outrun the truth forever. His final act of vengeance was complete, but his freedom was now at stake. The hunt begins. Sheriff Whitam issued an all-points bulletin for Roy Mercera. He dispatched deputies to every known address, every old associate, every hidden corner Mercera might have once frequented. The investigation broadened, looking not just for a murderer, but for a man who had been unjustly imprisoned, whose rage had simmered for decades. Whitam understood the unique tragedy of Roy Mercera, a victim turned perpetrator, driven by a profound injustice. But justice for the Grangers, however twisted the circumstances, still needed to be served. The Granger case was no longer just a local tragedy. It was a national example of delayed justice, of the long-term consequences of corruption and silence. Whitam felt the weight of it all, not just the lives lost, but the decades of lies that had poisoned his town. He had the full support of the state now, resources pouring into Dry Creek Hollow. The hunt for Roy Mercera was on, a final, desperate chase for the last piece of a puzzle whose outlines were now tragically clear. Part 4. The Hunter Becomes the Hunted. The manhunt for Roy Mercera intensified, transforming Dry Creek Hollow into a staging ground for law enforcement. State police, federal marshals, and local deputies swarmed the area, their presence a stark contrast to the town's usual quiet. Sheriff Dan Whitam led the charge, armed with Walter Granger's journals and the grim knowledge of Roy Mercera's meticulous vengeance. They knew who they were looking for, not just a killer, but a ghost who had walked among them, nursing a 14-year-old wound. But Roy Mercera was no ordinary fugitive. Years of wrongful imprisonment, followed by a life on the run, had honed his instincts for survival and evasion. He knew the back roads, the hidden trails, the forgotten cabins that dotted the Tennessee landscape. He moved like smoke, leaving behind no footprints, only whispers of his passing. Tips poured in, frantic calls from terrified citizens who swore they'd seen him, but each lead dissolved into thin air. Mercer seemed to anticipate their every move, slipping through their dragnet with an unsettling ease. He was a master of disappearing, a skill perfected through years of forced isolation. Whitam, frustrated but undeterred, began to think like Mercer. He pored over old maps, tracing the routes Mercer might have taken to and from prison, the hidden places he might have learned about during his youth. He studied Mercer's old habits, his love for fishing and solitary walks in the wilderness. He realized that Mercer wouldn't simply flee, he would likely stay close, perhaps even return to observe the chaos he had unleashed, to savor his retribution. The hunt became personal for Whitam, a chess match against a man driven by a profound, twisted sense of justice, the bait and the trap. Whitam knew that simply chasing Mercer wouldn't work. He needed to draw him out, to play on his pride, his need for validation. The key, Whitam believed, lay in the very injustice that had fueled Mercer for so long, the public confession of Walter Granger's lie. He called another press conference, this time not by the lake, but in the town square, right in front of the old courthouse where Walter Granger had presided. Whitam, his voice firm and clear, publicly acknowledged the profound miscarriage of justice against Roy Mercer. He detailed how Walter Granger had fabricated evidence, how the town's leaders had silently condoned it, and how Mercer had suffered for a crime he didn't commit. He laid bare the entire sordid history, painting Mercer not just as a killer, but as a victim of a system that had failed him. Roy Mercer suffered a grave injustice, Whitam stated, his words echoing across the square. He was wronged by this town, by those who put him away. But nothing, no injustice can ever justify what happened to the Granger family. We will find him, and he will face justice for all of them. The statement was a calculated risk. It was an olive branch, acknowledging Mercer's pain, but also an undeniable challenge. Whitam knew Mercer was watching, listening. He was offering Mercer a perverse kind of recognition, a public validation of his victimhood in exchange for surrender. Meanwhile, a quiet trap was being laid. Whitam, anticipating Mercer's possible return to significant locations from his past, perhaps his childhood home, or the old fishing spot, or even the abandoned prison where he spent years planning his revenge, set up discreet surveillance teams. They also focused on the dilapidated farm Mercer's family once owned, a place long abandoned but still holding personal significance, the final showdown. The bait worked. A few days after Whitam's public address, a local farmer reported a sighting, a lone figure, gaunt and silent, moving through the overgrown fields near the old Mercer farmstead. It was late afternoon, the sun casting long shadows as Whitam, accompanied by a small elite team, approached the abandoned farmhouse. The air was thick with tension, the only sound the rustle of dry weeds in the wind. Inside the dilapidated farmhouse, in what was once a child's bedroom, they found him. Roy Mercer sat on the floor, surrounded by old, faded photographs of himself as a young man, and yellowed newspaper clippings detailing Walter Granger's ascent, and later, his disappearance. He held a rusty old hunting rifle across his lap. His eyes, devoid of madness, held a deep, weary satisfaction. He didn't resist. He simply looked up at Whitam, a faint, knowing smile on his lips. "Took you long enough, Sheriff," Mercer rasped, his voice rough from disuse. Walter thought he was so clever. He thought he could bury a man's life and walk away clean. But the earth always tells its secrets eventually. Whitam held his gaze. The Grangers didn't deserve to pay for Walter's sins, Roy. Mercer's eyes hardened, a flicker of his old rage returning. They were his. They were all part of it. His family, his life, his stolen peace, all of it was mine to reclaim. A confession etched in vengeance, back at the station, in an interrogation room stripped bare of any comfort, Roy Mercer finally broke his 14-year silence. His confession was chilling in its detail, delivered with a detached, almost academic precision. He spoke not with regret, but with the grim satisfaction of a man who had completed a lifelong mission. He confirmed Walter's journals, the planted evidence, the forced confession. He described the agonizing years in Stonewall Penitentiary, the transformation from a quiet man to an instrument of vengeance. He explained how he had returned to Dry Creek Hollow, silent and unseen, tracking the Grangers for weeks, learning their routines. On that fateful July day in 1976, he had waited for them by Willow Lake. He described seeing Walter, Ellen, and the four children laughing as they cycled towards their picnic spot. He confronted Walter first, alone by the lake's edge after the family had settled. Walter, seeing him, had gone pale, recognizing the ghost he'd imprisoned. Mercer confirmed Walter's desperate, unsent letter, stating he had intercepted it from the mailbox that morning. He recounted the struggle with Walter, the fear in Ellen's eyes as she ran to her husband's aid, and the swift, brutal efficiency with which he silenced them both. He spared the children the struggle, quickly suffocating them, seeing it as a twisted act of mercy compared to the pain Walter had inflicted on him. He then buried the family in a shallow grave near the lake, weighted the bicycles and Walter's personal items, sinking them into the deepest part of the lake. He methodically covered his tracks, leaving no trace, no witness. He vanished again, a phantom in the night, certain his vengeance was complete and hidden forever. Mercer even revealed the location of Walter's old service revolver, buried separately from the family, a symbol of the lawman's fallen authority. It was exactly where Whitam had found the metal box. His confession was a horrifying testament to the depths of human vengeance and the catastrophic consequences of injustice. The story of the Granger family's vanishing, a local legend for 14 years, was now a solved case, stained with the blood of an innocent man's revenge. Dry Creek Hollow finally had its truth, raw and painful as it was. But the path to healing and the pursuit of a true, lasting justice had only just begun. Part 5. The Unfinished Reckoning. The arrest of Roy Mercer sent shockwaves far beyond Dry Creek Hollow. News crews descended, national headlines blared, and the story of the vanished family and the vengeful prisoner became a stark examination of justice, or the lack thereof, in rural America. The trial of Roy Mercer began months later, not in the old courthouse of Dry Creek Hollow, but in the larger, more modern county seat, a necessary concession to the overwhelming public interest and the need for a truly impartial jury. Sheriff Dan Whitam was the prosecution's star witness, meticulously recounting his investigation, the discovery of the bicycles, the journals of Walter Granger, the unearthing of the family's remains, and finally, Roy Mercer's chilling confession. He laid bare the entire painful truth: Walter Granger's corruption, the town's complicity, and the long, bitter road of vengeance that led to the murder of an innocent family. The courtroom was packed daily, filled with curious onlookers, reporters, and the stoic faces of Dry Creek Hollow residents, many of whom struggled to reconcile the gentle memories of the Granger children with the brutal reality of their deaths. Roy Mercer sat quietly throughout the proceedings, his face a mask of detached satisfaction. He offered no apology, no remorse for the Grangers' deaths. His defense, provided by a public defender, attempted to argue diminished capacity due to the trauma of his wrongful imprisonment and the historical context of the injustice he suffered. They painted Walter Granger as the true villain, Mercer as a tragic consequence. But the prosecution, while acknowledging the profound injustice Mercer faced, relentlessly focused on the innocent lives he took. The jury, after weeks of powerful testimony, wrestled with the complex narrative. They understood Mercer's pain, but they could not condone his actions. In the end, they found Roy Mercer guilty of multiple counts of murder. He was sentenced to life in prison, without the possibility of parole. He returned to Stonewall Penitentiary, the same walls that had forged his vengeance, now the final resting place for his bitter satisfaction. Dry Creek Hollow's painful truth. The conclusion of the trial did not bring immediate peace to Dry Creek Hollow. Instead, it tore open old wounds, exposing the festering silence that had defined the town for decades. The powerful figures Walter Granger had protected, Judge Harrison, Mayor Caldwell, and Joe Donnie, found themselves under intense scrutiny. A federal investigation, prompted by Whitam's findings, uncovered their deep involvement in the drug trade and other illicit activities that Walter had helped to suppress or facilitate. Arrests followed, stripping away the veneer of respectability from men who had built their empires on the suffering of others and the silence of a complicit town. Dry Creek Hollow was forced into a painful reckoning. The long-held narrative of Walter Granger, the town hero, crumbled, replaced by the grim truth of a corrupt lawman who sacrificed an innocent man for personal gain and societal convenience. The town grappled with its collective guilt, the understanding that their silence, their unquestioning trust in authority, had allowed injustice to fester, leading to unspeakable tragedy. Church sermons shifted from abstract forgiveness to hard truths about accountability. Community meetings turned into emotional confrontations as younger generations demanded transparency and justice for past wrongs. A small memorial was erected by Willow Lake, a simple stone bench, and a plaque bearing the names of the Granger family. It wasn't just a monument to their lost lives, but a silent testament to the devastating consequences of hidden truths. The lake, once a place of childhood joy, became a stark reminder of the dark secrets it had once held. Sheriff Whittam's unfinished work. Sheriff Dan Whitam emerged from the ordeal a changed man and a reluctant hero. He received accolades but also faced resistance from those who wished the past had stayed buried. He understood that true justice extended beyond convicting a killer. It meant dismantling the system that allowed such injustice to flourish. He became a tireless advocate for law enforcement reform, speaking at academies and conferences about the importance of integrity, accountability, and the corrosive power of silence. He preached that a police force must serve all citizens, not just the powerful, and that true peace could only be built on a foundation of honesty. He frequently visited Roy Mercera in Stonewall Penitentiary, not to gloat, but to listen. Mercer, in his final years, would speak only to Whitam, detailing the minute aspects of his wrongful conviction, the indignities of prison, and the unwavering resolve that fueled his vengeance. Whitam saw in Mercer not just a killer, but a mirror reflecting the profound failure of justice that had poisoned Dry Creek Hollow. He sought to understand, to ensure that such a systemic breakdown would never happen again, that no one else would be forced into Mercer's chilling path. The Granger case left an indelible scar on Dry Creek Hollow. The laughter of children no longer echoed carelessly from the Granger house. The old orchard stood solemn, its fruits no longer picked by innocent hands. But out of the darkness, a fragile hope began to emerge. The town, though wounded, started to heal, slowly, painfully, striving for a future built on transparency and genuine justice. Sheriff Whitam would often stand by Willow Lake at dusk, watching the water ripple under the moonlight. The Granger family had found their resting place. Roy Mercera, his final prison. But the ripples of injustice, of a town's long silence, continued to spread. Whitam knew his work was not done. His mission was to ensure that the tragic story of the Granger family and the bitter vengeance of Roy Mercera would serve as a constant reminder that the truth, no matter how deeply buried, will always find a way to break the silence, and that the true cost of justice sometimes is paid not by those who seek it, but by those who deny it.